A pistol magazine lay on the tarmac of an empty car park. Nearby, a car with its door hanging open and a young man slumped unconscious across the front seat. The girl who had been sitting beside him minutes earlier was simply gone. That magazine was very nearly the only thing her abductor left behind. Her name was Carla Walker. The Fort Worth murder that followed became one of the most notorious Texas cold cases of the 20th century, and decades later, one of the most consequential forensic breakthroughs in American policing. You will often hear it described as a touch DNA case. The trial record is more precise and rather more grim. The DNA came from staining on the clothing she was wearing the night she was taken. Carla Jan Walker was born on the 31st of January, 1957, in Texas. By February 1974, she had just turned 17. She was a student at Western Hills High School on the west side of Fort Worth, in a neighborhood of low brick houses, wide streets, and pickup trucks parked on cracked driveways. By every account left in the record, she was popular, sociable, and entirely ordinary in the way that makes a loss like this unbearable. She had a large family. Among her siblings was her younger brother Jim Walker, who was a boy of 12 in the winter of 1974. He would spend the rest of his adult life carrying what happened to his sister. The phone calls, the anniversaries, the file that never closed, the questions that arrived every February, whether he wanted them or not. To understand why this case went cold, you have to understand the city it happened in. Fort Worth in 1974 was a place of stockyards and oil offices, a city of about 400,000 people that still thought of itself as small. Teenagers went to school dances, then to drive-ins, then to the bowling alley. Their parents did not lock the doors and did not, on the whole, worry very much. That is the world Carla Walker moved through on the last evening of her life. Valentine's Day had fallen 3 days earlier. There was a dance. There were friends and a boyfriend, and the ordinary machinery of a Saturday night in a mid-sized American city. Nothing in the record suggests she had any reason to be afraid of anyone. On the evening of the 16th of February, 1974, Carla attended a Valentine's dance with her boyfriend. Afterwards, as young couples across the city did, they drove out to the Ridgely Bowl, the bowling alley on the west side of Fort Worth. They parked in the lot. It was somewhere around midnight, which made it now the early hours of the 17th. What happened next took perhaps a minute. A man came to the car. There was a violent struggle inside it. Carla's boyfriend was struck about the head and knocked unconscious. When he regained consciousness, the passenger seat beside him was empty. Carla was gone. He raised the alarm. Fort Worth police officers reached the car park within the hour. They photographed the vehicle. They took his account. And on the ground, they recovered a magazine from a .22 caliber Ruger pistol. Think about what that object represented. Somebody had brought a firearm to a bowling alley car park, used it or brandished it during a struggle, and dropped part of it in the confusion. It was a mistake, precisely the kind of mistake investigators build entire cases on. It was also, for 46 years, a mistake that led absolutely nowhere. The search was enormous. Officers, volunteers, neighbors, classmates, hundreds of people walking fields, creek beds, and roadside ditches in the February cold. Her family waited by the telephone for 3 days, in a house that filled steadily with relatives and casseroles and silence. On the 20th of February, 1974, Carla Walker's body was found in a culvert in the Benbrook Lake area, southwest of the city. Reporting placed the site roughly 9 miles from where she had been taken, a short drive, 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour on empty roads. She had been sexually assaulted. According to the post-mortem findings, she had been strangled. Contemporary reporting said her death occurred sometime after the 18th of February, meaning she may have been held alive for as long as 2 days. That detail has never stopped hurting the people who loved her. Her clothing was collected at the scene and retained by the police department. Among those items was her bra. In 1974, that garment could tell investigators almost nothing at all. Here is precisely what forensic science could do in 1974. Serology, blood typing. A biological stain could be tested to establish a blood group, and a blood group might narrow a suspect pool to several million people. It could exclude. It could never identify. There was no DNA profiling available to criminal casework, and there would not be for another decade and a half. Hair comparison was subjective. Fingerprints required a surface that held them and a suspect already on file. Tire impressions in a public car park were worthless. There were no security cameras. There were no mobile phone records because there were no mobile phones. So detectives did what detectives did. They worked the one physical lead they actually had. They set out to trace purchasers of .22 caliber Ruger pistols across the Fort Worth area. A laborious paper exercise involving dealer records, handwritten registers, and door-to-door interviews. One of the names that surfaced during that trace was a local man named Glenn Samuel McCurley. He was interviewed in 1974. He gave an account of his weapon and his movements that detectives could not, at the time, disprove. With no forensic evidence capable of tying any individual to Carla's clothing, he passed out of the investigation. He would go on living in Fort Worth for the next 46 years. The case went cold, but it never went away. Successive Fort Worth detectives pulled the file across the decades. Tips were logged and chased. Persons of interest were looked at, questioned, and eliminated. Rumors circulated in the neighborhood for years about who had done it, and none of them could be tested against anything solid. And this is where the popular version of the story gets it wrong. The evidence did not sit untouched in a sealed box, patiently waiting for science to catch up. It was tested. It was tested, and it failed. By the late 2000s, attempts had already been made to extract a usable DNA profile from the preserved clothing. The biological material was degraded and mixed, and there was too little of it. Conventional testing could not read it. That is the real cruelty of a cold case. Not that nobody tried, but that people tried, repeatedly, across generations of detectives, and the answer stayed a fraction out of reach every single time. Consider what investigators were up against. An abduction from a public car park, at night, with a single surviving witness who had been knocked unconscious during the attack. No known motive, no connection between victim and offender that anyone could establish. In cases like this, suspicion has a way of settling on the person nearest to the victim, and Carla's boyfriend spent years living under the shadow of a crime he had also been a victim of. The record does not support the idea that he was responsible, and the eventual forensic result excluded him entirely. Other men were looked at over the years. Some were interviewed more than once. None could be linked to the physical evidence, because the physical evidence could not be read. Every theory ended at the same wall, a stained garment in an evidence room, holding the only certain identification in the entire case, and nobody able to unlock it. So the file sat. Carla's parents grew older without an answer. Her brother Jim grew from a 12-year-old boy into a middle-aged man who still spoke about her in the present tense. Then, in 2019, the case was reopened again. What had changed was not the evidence. What had changed was the chemistry. The clothing was sent to the Serological Research Institute in California, where analysts using more sensitive extraction techniques succeeded where earlier laboratories had not. They developed a single-source male DNA profile from the staining on Carla Walker's clothing. For the first time in 45 years, investigators held one man's genetic signature, isolated and readable. But a profile is only useful if you have something to compare it against. Searches of the National Criminal DNA Database produced no match. The man was not in the system. He had never been convicted of anything that would have put him there. So in 2020, the sample went to Othram, a private forensic laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, built specifically for evidence like this. Othram performs forensic-grade genome sequencing. Instead of reading the 20 or so standard markers used in police profiling, it reads hundreds of thousands of genetic variants across the genome. That density of information allows analysts to identify distant relatives, third and fourth cousins, within public genealogy databases, and then to build family trees backwards until the branches converge on a single household. The advanced testing was not funded by the police department. According to reporting, it was paid for through donations connected to NBC and the producers of the Oxygen program, The DNA of Murder. A murder investigation in one of America's largest cities was advanced by a television budget. That is a fact about the resourcing of cold cases that ought to sit uncomfortably with anyone who hears it. The genealogy converged on the McCurley family, and within that family, one man had already appeared in the 1974 file, traced all those years earlier through the purchase of a Ruger pistol. Investigators obtained a comparison sample. It matched. On the 21st of September 2020, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested at his Fort Worth home. He was 77 years old. He had lived for 4.5 decades, no further than a short suburban drive from the family that had spent that entire time waiting. He was charged with capital murder. He initially denied involvement, and detectives conducted recorded interviews with him that later formed part of the court proceedings. The trial opened in Tarrant County in August 2021. A jury heard 2 days of evidence. Then, on the 24th of August 2021, McCurley changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to capital murder and was sentenced to life imprisonment. 47 years after Carla Walker was taken from a bowling alley car park, the case was legally closed. What broke it was not a confession and not a witness. It was the decision taken by generations of Fort Worth officers who never met each other to keep a teenage girl's clothing on a shelf through decades when nobody alive could read it. That preservation is the legacy. The Walker case became one of the most cited demonstrations anywhere that biological material from the 1970s, degraded, mixed, previously tested, and previously declared useless, can still yield a name under forensic-grade genome sequencing. Agencies across the United States have since resubmitted evidence that earlier laboratories had written off as exhausted. It also raised questions that have not been settled. Genetic genealogy works by searching the DNA of relatives who never consented to a police search. Courts and legislatures are still deciding where the boundaries lie between a family tree and a warrant. For Jim Walker, who was 12 years old when his sister did not come home, the answer arrived after a lifetime of asking for it. He had campaigned, publicly and persistently, to keep her name in front of the people who could do something about it. Remember that pistol magazine on the tarmac? In 1974, it pointed investigators towards the right man and could not hold him. It took the genome itself to finish the sentence that a piece of drop metal started. If you want to understand how many cases are still sitting on shelves exactly like Carla's, tested once, filed away, quietly waiting for chemistry to improve, we have covered dozens of them, and the pattern is almost always the same. Subscribe. We investigate a new cold case every single day. Stay curious, stay skeptical.